Good evening, and welcome to this edition of Labor Vision. I'm Bob Delaney, Executive Director of the Institute for Labor Studies and Research. Labor Vision, a production of the Institute, focuses on topics of importance and interest to working Rhode Islanders. We hope you enjoy this evening's edition.
With that, I'm going to turn it over to David.
With the crisis of public pension plans in the news literally every week and sometimes every day, I'd like to offer up an analysis of what I think is actually happening to public pension funds and share my perspective on how unions and policymakers can address solutions to pension funding within the context of state budget crises. As part of this discussion, I'm going to try to utilize some of my private sector work experience. So let's start by getting a handle on the facts and determining what the true financial condition of public funds are across the country. And to present this picture, I'm going to depend on various reports prepared by the Center for Retirement Research at Boston College. And because I'm relying on a lot of data from the Center for Retirement Research, I have to disclose that I act as an advisor to their project on public pension plans. So this chart shows the aggregate funding ratios for state and local pension plans for the last 15 years. Let me offer a couple observations about what this chart's telling us. It's telling us that funding ratios actually peaked in 1999, 12 years ago. Our problems didn't start in 2008. They really started a decade ago when the tech bubble burst and created havoc in funding ratios for public pension funds and private pension funds. The 2008 global financial crisis reinforced what was a very bad decade for pension plan performance. During the past decade, what this chart's telling us is that the average public pension fund lost 26 percentage points of funding. That's obviously quite significant. And this chart compares the market value. So now we're looking at dollars, not percentages. The market assets are in gray, and something called the actuarial assets, which are smoothed over time, are in red for the last decade. It demonstrates the absolute dollar damage incurred from the 2008 global financial collapse. Public pension funds lost $800 billion. I'll repeat that, $800 billion in less than a year, declining from $2.9 trillion to $2.1 trillion over a 2-year period. Now, plans have recovered about $300 billion of those losses, bringing them back to 2005 asset levels. This chart also shows us that there are about $300 billion of actuarial losses still in the pipeline. And what this means is it's going to create a funding headwind to recovery in the future. And I'm not going to address this today, but this analysis is based on economic investment returns of 8%. And as many of you know, there's a raging debate over whether defined benefit plans should be using risk-free rates of 5% or less. But we're not going to get into that debate today. That could take up an entire day's time. Now, so how have plan sponsors responded to this decade of underfunding? One way to measure plan sponsors' commitment to their plans is to determine if they're paying something called the annual required contribution. The acronym is ARC. And the ARC is something that is measured and reported on by GASB, the Government Accounting Standard Board. The ARC equals the normal cost of the benefit in a given year, the accrued benefit for that year, plus the amortized payment of any unfunded liability for, say, the next 30 years. So this slide shows us the historic growth of the ARC, more than doubling to 13.5% of payroll over the past decade. But this related chart shows that the percent of ARC actually being paid by the plan sponsors, the state and or local governments, has dropped off over this period of time to only 78% of what is required under GASB, the Accounting Standards Board. So it raises some serious questions as to how prudent state legislatures have been in funding plans over the past decade. Another useful metric when assessing a pension plan's financial status is comparing assets to benefit payments. So this is really a measure of liquidity and sufficiency, the ability of a pension plan to pay its benefit obligations on a going forward basis. So this slide shows us that at the beginning of the decade, before the damage of two global financial crises, plan assets actually covered 24 years of benefit payments. But by 2009, this had dropped in half to 13 years. So this metric literally suggests, and remember, these are averages, it literally suggests that a number of plans face a solvency crisis in the near future. Now, voices on the political right and even some on the left in the Democratic Party point to information like this and conclude that public plans are unaffordable and therefore have to be cut back or converted to defined contribution plans. But these conclusions are somewhat inconsistent with the facts. Again, a report from the Center for Retirement Research calculated that pension contributions averaged 3.8% of total state expenditures in 2008. That little slice of pie, dead center in this chart. Obviously, education, social services, and salaries were the bulk of state expenditures. And what is most interesting is that pension contributions as a percent of state expenditures has historically been declining from nearly 6% for 30 years prior to 1990. The Center for Retirement Research projects that pension contributions will have to increase 1% to 2%, up to 5% of state budget expenditures beyond 2014. So I think this and the history I just shared with you presents a very different picture of sustainability of public plans. Now, at the same time, I'm not suggesting that public plans don't have structural problems and serious funding challenges. Let me offer a couple examples of these structural vulnerabilities that, if not addressed, could undermine the future sustainability of public funds. Public and private pension plans in this country have moved into a mature phase of their life cycle. As plans mature, the inactive population of retirees and terminated vesteds increases and grows significantly larger than the active population of workers in the plan. Therefore, the structure of the plan liabilities, the accrued benefits, become overweighted towards retirees and terminated vesteds. The inactive liability in many plans has grown to 70 to 75% of the total liability structure. These inactive liabilities are owed sooner than active liabilities, and they're much more sensitive to investment return. At the same time, as the workforce is aging, these plans are entering what I call the decumulation stage as more workers retire. This leads to a growing trend of negative cash flow as plan benefit payments start to far exceed contribution income. So these changing demographics and the liability structure of a mature defined benefit plan creates something called leverage, which alters the risk profile of the plan. What is leverage? Leverage refers to the relationship between contributions coming in and the existing plan assets. So as the plan matures and grows, the leverage increases over time. When assets represent large multiples of contributions, over contributions, the volatility of investment performance starts dominating the funding ratio and the future survival of the plan. Now, a simple example of this is a $30 billion public fund, which is leveraged 30 to 1 between assets and contributions. So you would have $1 billion of contributions coming in. If this plan was expecting 8% return on its assets, another $2.5 billion would be coming in that same year. That investment income then represents 70% of the total income of the plan. That's leverage. And it shows you how dependent mature plans are on their investment return. These points about plan maturity and leverage do not diminish the importance of setting the correct contribution income. Contributions below the arc will eventually defund a plan over time. The point I'm trying to impress is that investment return dominates the funding of defined benefit plans in the mature stage. Now, an example of this is the experience of the largest public fund in the nation, CalPERS, the California State Retirement System. This chart is taken off the CalPERS website. It shows assets and liabilities in the bars and the funded ratio in the boxes. And you have a history here going back to 1987. CalPERS entered the decade significantly overfunded at 127%. The tech bubble literally destroyed 47 percentage points of funding by 2003. The plan recovered over the next 4 years to 101% funded by 2007, and then bam, 2008 hits, we lose another 39% of funding. This investment experience triggered a tripling of contributions to $10 billion over this period of time. This level of investment volatility and contribution instability cannot be repeated in the future without undermining the economic and political integrity of a pension system. Thank you. So now that we have a sense of what is broken and in need of correction, what can unions and other stakeholders do to protect defined benefit plans? Up until now, the battle lines have been drawn. Unions have attempted to defend the status quo. In all due respect, I believe this strategy has failed and will fail in the future. And I want to suggest 3 broad areas of action that are potentially game changers. First, pension boards have to become more engaged in the governance of companies that they own. Traditional fiduciary rules have to be expanded to encourage responsible investment principles aimed at controlling systemic market risks and promoting sustainable economy going forward. Let's not forget that the true cause of the current funding crisis of public and private pension plans in this country is a total breakdown of corporate governance of the banking and insurance sectors, and a rush to deregulation which led to a contagion of irresponsible and dangerous financial leverage that nearly destroyed the global capital markets. So pension plans and the tens of millions of participants that were victimized by Wall Street and the failure of federal regulators to control the animal spirits of the financial sector that had grown to dominate the U.S. economy and Congress. Another policy area that needs pension plan attention is monetary policy. We know how important stable investment income is to pension plans. We have recently discovered the adverse consequences to pension plans of severe market risk and volatility. We need a Federal Reserve Bank that can manage irrational exuberance in the capital markets and protect us from bad economic behavior. Another danger to pension plans is historically low interest rates mandated by the Federal Reserve Bank. Low interest rates are an important tool to stimulate demand in a great recession like we just experienced, that has plagued the economy and literally bordered on a depression. But low interest rates have failed to stimulate the economy and reduce unemployment. At the same time, low interest rates are distinctly unfriendly to saver institutions. Let me sort of cut to the chase here and suggest one last idea, and that is unions have to rethink benefit design before more benefit reductions or worse are imposed. My union, for example, has designed a hybrid plan. We call it a variable defined benefit plan. The plan is based on the premise of being financially sustainable in all economic environments and being economically attractive to employers by targeting fully funded status at all times with stable and affordable contributions. Our variable plan does this by assuming an investment return of between 4 and 5%, in contrast to the 7.5% to 8% used by most public and private plans. This means the benefit costs more, but the benefit promise is more secure. Our plan further mitigates risk by immunizing retiree liabilities when the participant actually retires, and by utilizing a low-risk investment strategy that essentially excludes public equity. The plan is structured with a defined benefit floor that is guaranteed and a variable benefit that can fluctuate up and down depending on investment performance. Participants receive the greater of the floor benefit or the variable benefit, but never less than the floor. Of course, this means that a portion of the benefit is at risk to investment. Unions should also consider new financing sources for fund pensions. Pension obligation bonds have gotten a bad name because they've been misused, but if utilized prudentially to fill funding deficits, not as a substitute for annual contributions, they could help rebuild pension funding health. States could also secure public assets to create a stream of income to fund pension plans without privatizing assets. The public sector can be just as creative as the private sector in using its balance sheet to finance its obligations in a safe and responsible way. So in closing, my advice to pension stakeholders in the current uncertain economic environment is to be creative contributors to problem solving. The pension deal, as we knew it, that emerged in the post-World War II era is in the process of being renegotiated. Maintaining the status quo will not guarantee you a role at the bargaining table. Renegotiating the pension deal requires an understanding of the risks to the pension system and how those risks can be best managed based on sustainable financial models. The current situation is wrought with danger and opportunity. Organized labor must seize the day and build a better and more secure retirement future for American workers. Thanks very much.
Having listened to David, and give us the big picture, I'd like to bring it down a little bit to our biggest little state in the union. It was about 5 years ago. It was about 2006, 2007, and our state labor relations board always holds a seminar that is a coalition of all the state labor relations boards, and I forget where we were, and a few of you in this room probably were there, and whether it was Vermont or Waterville Valley, and this husband and wife got up and had done a study for the Pew Institute called Promises with a Price. And, they got up and they started to go through this research that they had done, and at the time it hadn't become a burning issue yet. But I remember, they had us look at a particular page, and the page of the publication was state pension funding levels in 2006. And they had it all color-coded, and the only state that was in worse shape than Rhode Island was West Virginia. And I remember that one of the members of this couple said, anyone here from Rhode Island? And all together, management and labor, we all just kind of went down in our seats. Nobody, and we were all, frankly, very much in shock. The handwriting was on the wall, and it was clear that something had to be done. So, having said that, I'm really going to take it down to, I think Rick was talking about the lawyers who love to be word engineers. My firm is handling the current litigation of the Council 94 and other unions, including Bob's, who are plaintiffs in the case started as against Governor Chafee, but it started against Governor Carcieri, and Governor Chafee has been substituted as the defendant in the case, and it has to do with the changes made in the pension system in 2009 and 10. And I would really like to go back a little bit, because as I look around the room, I think once in a while you need a little refresher about how we got here. And the fact of the matter is that the state retirement system was created in 1936. And that's important because that's a long time before any statute said anything about public sector bargaining in the state of Rhode Island. In fact, that didn't happen until 1958, and when that statute was passed about the right of state employees to organize and to have bargaining representatives, there was no duty to bargain in the 58 statute. So we've got the state retirement system in place. We've got new legislation in 58, but it still doesn't give the state employees the right to bargain. There's some mention in 1966 in an amendment to that statute that talks about bargaining collectively, and then it's not until 1972 that statute is amended and says that the parties will negotiate, the state employees and the state will negotiate, and that any agreement they reach will be reduced to writing. So this whole system predated the right to bargain in the public sector by 30 some odd years, 36 years if I'm not mistaken. So then in 1979, what do we have? We have another statute that says retirement system matters are excluded from collective bargaining. So any and all matters relating to the employee's retirement system of the state of Rhode Island are now excluded as negotiable items in the collective bargaining process. So it's been taken right out of that contract arena. And then we zoom forward to 2009 and 2010 when the General Assembly, probably having spoken to the authors of Promises with a Price and knowing the handwriting on the wall, make some changes in the state retirement system. So with that said, and then of course once those changes were made, the unions filed suit against Governor Carcieri, and that's what's pending now. Now I've put something up here. Can we get back to, how do we get back to the, there we go, hold on a second. I put a chart up here, this is more for my benefit than anyone's, I suppose, because it's, again, good to go back and remind yourself what exactly happened. And what I sort of did was I mapped out, that's what it was, years of contributing service, years of total service, and age. And those 5 combinations, and some of you may say, you don't have this quite right, and maybe I don't, so bear with me. But basically, it was these combinations which got you past go to collect a pension. Post '09, these are the changes that have been made. So, that 10 is obviously 10 years. By July 1, 05, age 60 gets you a pension if you retire by 10/1/09, or if you're eligible to retire as of September 30, 09, or if you have 10 years by 7/1/05. It doesn't matter what your age is, as long as you have 28 years of service. Again, you pass go, you get your pension if you jumped through the window of opportunity. And let's see if I can go over here and just bring it down. Good thing I know how to surf on these things, I guess. Nope. I want to see the bottom of this, but you're actually not missing much of anything there, except that 10 contributing years of service and 65 gets you a pension. And then if I could figure out how to get it to the next line, 29 total years and 62 gets you a pension. And then the issue is, if you're not eligible on the contributing years and you're not eligible on the total years of service, at 62 you get a pension, but with a proportional downward adjustment in age based on years of service. So those were the changes that were made. And I'll see if I can figure out how to bring that screen up a little bit so that you can see the bottom. And I brought some copies in case, and it's just a refresher. So, I know that some of you lived this very up close and personal when it was happening, and obviously we're continuing to live it now because this is what is at stake in the pending lawsuit against Governor Chafee by the unions. So, and the other thing that the changes in 09 and 010 did was that it changed the COLA to the first $35,000 of the retirement allowance, and it kicks in on the 3rd anniversary date of retirement, or when the retiree hits 65, whichever of those happens later. Okay, so 8 unions sue in the state court. What have the unions argued? The unions have argued that the 09 and 2010 amendments to the statute violate the contracts clause of the Rhode Island Constitution and also the takings clause of the Rhode Island Constitution. And as I mentioned, it's only on behalf of people who have not yet retired or are not yet eligible to retire. So now it's a contract claim. It's based on the contracts clause of the Constitution. And the state has moved for summary judgment. For those of you, that's the quick, who aren't lawyers, summary judgment is the quick way to end a lawsuit. And you can only do that if there are no questions of fact. If it's purely a matter of law, that's the way, one party or the other will say to the court, this case does not involve issues of fact. It only involves issues of law. Decided on the law, please. So when I read, I didn't draft this brief. John Tarantino and other partners at Adler Pollack did. And when I read it, the first thing I thought was, I wonder if the unions will file a cross motion for summary judgment. The answer, I think, is that probably not, because if there are questions of fact, they're not in this part of the lawsuit that I'm talking about right now, that you'll probably read about in the next couple of weeks, because the hearing is scheduled for the 18th of July. So the issue is there a violation of the contracts clause? Is there a violation of the takings clause? The unions will have to establish that there's a contractual relationship. They'll have to prove that it impairs that contractual relationship. They'll have to prove that the legislation in 09 and 10 substantially impaired it. And even if they get to that point, the legislature is still okay in doing what it did if it's reasonable and necessary to fulfill an important purpose. If we get that far, you all know what the important purpose is going to be. It's going to be the dire economic situation that we are experiencing here in Rhode Island and that David talked about our having to address. So the problem, in a nutshell, that the unions are going to have, and this is where I'm really going to sound like an advocate for the management side, is that there are several precedents that are going to bear on this. Those the precedents, unfortunately, the plaintiffs in the two leading cases are Rhode Island Council 94 and the NEA. And the Council 94 case was in the federal court, so is the NEA case. Here there is actually quite a bit of law. And when you read the cases, I mean, I'm not going to say anybody had ESP, but there were people who were forward thinking. There were judges who were talking about what if the state of Rhode Island takes a meat axe to the state employees' pension system. And I think that was a case that goes back to 1990. So that's 21 years ago when judges were saying, well, we're deciding this issue now, but when we're wondering what happens when the state of Rhode Island takes a meat axe to the pension system. And Judge Smith in the federal court in the Council 94 retiree health case said that the employees could never have thought that their benefits and their eligibility were fossilized in legislative amber. That was his comment. So you have a meat axe, which clearly will cut something that's soft like meat. And you have the Judge Smith saying, it would have been unreasonable to think that these benefits and these eligibility criteria were fossilized in legislative amber. So we can only, I think the case law gives us some very good guidance as to where this is going. And I'm sure that we will hear the other side of this from Bob. But stay tuned. The union's brief due tomorrow, and the hearing is on July 18th. Thank you very much.
When I saw the program, it said pensions, a reality check. And I wanted to draw a distinction between pensions and retirement plans. And you look up the word pensions in the dictionary, and there's the definition right there, a fixed amount paid on a regular basis. Those types of plans have been the mainstay of retirement plans even in private industry for many years. But a pension plan is only one kind of retirement plan. There are 401ks, 457s, 403bs. Those are all retirement plans. And while they have the potential to produce regular income streams, they are not pension plans. So in those two categories, in the retirement plan universe, defined benefit plans, the good old favorite, final average pay, career average pay, more recently cash balance, references on the table this morning to a hybrid plan, a mixture of different plan designs. And then the large category of defined contribution. 401k, 457, 403b, profit sharing, and ESOPs, employee share ownership plans. With that clarified, I must tell you that from a private sector perspective, the bad news is that pensions are poison. Pensions are a topic at the bargaining table that just makes every conversation that much more difficult. And let me just give you a few examples of why that's true. Again, firstly, accrual accounting. The obligation to treat pensions, and this goes way back now, but the obligation to treat pensions from an accounting and finance perspective, not as a pay-as-you-go expense, but as an accrued obligation recognized while the employees are performing their service, had a huge impact on the expense associated with pensions, particularly as the plans matured and became populated more by people not working than people working. Balance sheet disclosure. Private entities have had to disclose on their balance sheets the existence of these liabilities for nearly 30 years. Those balance sheet disclosures have a meaningful impact on the ability of private entities to secure private financing. The question is, can the entity meet its obligations for pensions? Now, those balance sheet disclosures have not been in effect on the public side for very long at all, and except for a blip about 6 months ago in the muni market, amazingly, lenders are still coming forward willing to lend money to public entities despite the existence of huge unfunded liabilities on their balance sheets. I will tell you that that was not true on the private side, and those disclosures had an impact on how companies approached the promises that they made for pensions. Government regulation. Man, there are reams and reams of regulations that impact the way a private entity provides pensions to its employees. Just a couple of quick examples. Funding requirements. You have the Department of Labor establishing requirements for the funding of a qualified pension plan. Down the street, you have the IRS saying, whoa, 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 not so fast. There are maximum deductible contribution limits that you must comply with. So one agency of the government is encouraging you to dump money in. One agency is saying, hold on, we don't want so much in, because the more money that goes into the pension trust, A, the larger the tax deduction for the entity, and B, the larger amount of money that now is tax-free, not being reported as income by the employer on its annual tax return. Discrimination testing, the obligation to run very complex and very expensive testing to prove that the plan is being provided on a non-discriminatory basis for employees across the organization, that it is not generating excessive or overly generous benefits for the highly compensated employees. PBGC premiums, Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation. Think of it as FDIC for the pension world. It's a government agency that ensures the payment of benefits to participants in private pension plans. Great idea. Started out with a premium of $1 per year per participant. That was the theory. Just $1 from every participant and we'll be all set. Didn't quite work out. It got doubled to $2. PBGC still in huge deficit. The premium went to $19 per participant. PBGC still in huge deficit. Variable premiums. Now they went to plans and said, and this is really weird, if you're underfunded, we're going to charge you more because your plan is at risk and may end up on our doorstep. So we're going to sock you for the basic premium and the variable premium. Today, the PBGC is still suffering with record deficits on the plans that it has been required to assume control of. We've heard about the sensitivity to stock market performance. When your promise to your employees depends more on how well your investments did than on how well your business performed, you've got a very flawed structural system in your employment relationship with your employees. And that's what's happened with these large pension plans. Interest rate sensitivity. When you use interest rates to value pension liabilities, and everybody says, my mortgage rate's low because we're in historic lows on interest rates, it may be great to borrow money for your house, but it's lousy if you're valuing liabilities in a pension plan, because the lower the rate, the larger your liability. The larger your liability, the worse your funded status. So these are all factors that are well outside the control of most private entities, and yet it controls a significant piece of their burden and their financial obligation to their employees. All of which leads to a low correlation between the cost of the benefit that you deliver and the expense you have to incur to provide it. That's the worst of both worlds. If you're an employer trying to manage the cost of your employment and you have a huge thing in the mix, the cost of which, or the expense for which, has very little to do with the actual cost of the benefit, you've got real trouble. You've got a real problem. I'll give you an example with National Grid. The last time that the pension plan was improved was in 2007. 18 years, and the pension plan was not improved. There were discussions during that time about retirement plans and lots of conversations about defined contribution that we'll talk about in a minute, but the pension plan was held stable over that time period. And I'm not there anymore, but I would venture to guess that will be the case going forward as well. The only thing more toxic at the bargaining table or in an employer's management of the cost of employment is retiree health care. And that is an issue that is now coming right up against this pension crisis and public pensions. The public promises for retiree medical benefits are huge, massive. In the town I live in, they're twice as large as the pension promises made to the employees of the town. So in a corporate world, these retiree medical benefits have been a huge drag on the willingness of any employer to talk about pension improvements. I think of them as pensions on steroids. The obligation escalates. It's not a fixed payment to retirees, and it's tied to healthcare inflation, not CPI. So To sort this out, I would just remind everyone who must already know this, that this is also an advanced area of actuarial science. Large corporations spend hundreds of thousands of dollars with actuaries to measure, monitor, recommend on management of these liabilities from an actuarial perspective. It is very complicated. I had a very difficult time getting the attention of any of the taxpayers at the Holliston town meeting when I got up and spoke. It was like as soon as I mentioned unsustainable and unreasonable actuarial assumptions, everybody's eyes just glazed over. I could have been talking about the water department as far as they were concerned. On the union side, in my experience, the unions do not typically spend a lot of money on actuaries. At our bargaining sessions, I would always bring the actuary in. The actuary would present the actuarial report. The union could ask questions, but the union itself would not engage actuaries on its own side to either A, gain a better understanding of plan funding and operation, or to challenge the employer over the content of the report or the assumptions that were being made. And I would suggest that if we're going to bargain effectively about pensions, that both sides need to be equally informed. And one of my urgings today is to have unions become more involved and get more connected to experts in the financial actuarial world who can give you the kind of information and insight you need to deal with company advocates who are coming fully armed with very high-priced consultants. What am I doing wrong? Here's a quick little chart. I'm going to wrap it up. Quick little chart. Defined contribution versus defined benefit. A couple of characteristics. Why are defined contribution plans so much more attractive to employers? Here are some of the reasons. Is the expense predictable? Yes. Defined benefit? No. Is it sensitive to interest rates? No. Defined benefit plan? Absolutely. Is the expense linked to the benefit cost? Very highly, practically perfectly. Is a defined benefit plan? No. Can you turn on and turn off the benefit obligation? Defined contribution, yes. Defined benefit, no. Do you have to pay PBGC premiums? DC, no. Defined benefit, yes. And is the benefit portable? DC, yes. DB, no. These are the factors that are driving private sector employers, and I believe this will eventually make its way, as it has in other states, to the public bargaining table as well, the public state houses or entities that control the design of public pensions, the transition to defined contribution plans. So my last slide. The basics on defined contribution, just to leave you with a little commercial from the private perspective experience. It's a matter of starting early. It's a matter of getting the match, increase the savings while you're working, diversify your investments, and stick to it. And what's interesting is nearly every 401k vendor out there in the world today have automated systems now. You come to work for the company, you're automatically enrolled. You don't want the plan, you have to actually take action to withdraw from participation in the plan. Once you're in the plan, you automatically increase your savings every year. You don't want to increase your savings, you have to withdraw. Your investments are automatically invested in a basket of investments tied to your retirement horizon. No more sticking money in guaranteed funds that pay very little. And auto rebalance, a process of making sure that over the course of your career, your investments get rebalanced to keep your risk profile in line with your age. So I would leave you with a sense that on the private side, the challenge of pensions has transitioned away from trying to figure out how to pay for expensive and very difficult to control defined benefit plans, and moving to providing retirement income for employees through defined contribution programs. Thank you very much.
Since we're at Providence College, instead of talking about lots of numbers, and you can't avoid talking about numbers, it'll be more appropriate to use a few parables to explain the pension situation. First, let me refer to the prior three presentations quickly to do them justice. For David's presentation, take all the numbers that he had, and Rhode Island's worse in every category. When the average pension plan was over 100% funded in 1999, we were only 80% funded. As an actuary once joked to me, actuaries have their own weird sense of humor, The good thing about being underfunded is when the market goes down 20%, you only go down 16% if you start out at 80% funded. Actually, I swear that's funny. Well, Rhode Island's only 50% funded, so imagine how swell we'll be in a down market. We'll only take half the hit of everyone else. I'm not going to talk a lot about the lawsuit, why tip our hand, but Lori gave a very accurate representation of the lawsuit. With the possible exception, she considered the meat axe as cutting something soft. We have this vision of a meat axe is what they did to the pension system as opposed to with a fillet knife. We do think that the prior two cases she referred to had very specific facts that differentiate things from the other case, and more importantly, when the second round of 3 rounds of pension changes occurred at the legislative level, we said, if you do this, we will sue you. And we are, as most of you folks know, at the bargaining table, we keep our word. They did this, so we sued them. And we'll see how that plays out in the courts, affecting, we think it's wrong to affect vested benefits for employees. My favorite part of Bill's presentation is talking about we don't bring financial experts to the table. I like that because now we can blame management. We just asked. I mean, they gave it to us. We figured they knew what they were doing. Nonetheless, we are where we are in Rhode Island with a state and teacher pension plan that's under 50% funded. And we've got, because we are Rhode Island, some unique facts that make us different. Retirement for a very long time was referred to as a preparing for retirement was referred to as a 3-legged stool. One leg was your defined benefit pension plan, another was your savings plan, and then in the 70s your savings plan could be a 401k or a 403b or other things. And the third leg was Social Security. And if you take those 3 legs together, you could have a basis for a secure retirement if you manage things correctly. Rhode Island being Rhode Island, we're one of 3 states in the country where community by community teachers opt into or opt out of Social Security. So just about half of our teachers in 20 of our 39 communities don't get the advantage of Social Security, so their stool is already wobbling. The savings part, the 401k or 403b, is variable. That's the grasshopper and the ant parable. You can be an ant and studiously save and retire early or retire later. You can be a grasshopper and rely only on your pension and possibly your Social Security if you get it. And in theory, if you looked at the numbers in the past, that could still be enough. You might work longer to get there. And then there's the pension system itself. Lori talked about the founding of the pension system back in 1936. We had an unfunded liability then. We have an unfunded liability now. We didn't have to have one now. We didn't start using actuarial data until maybe 15 years ago to govern the state investments. The state almost always put in what they were supposed to, with some glaring exceptions. During the banking crisis they didn't, but they made a public policy decision not to. It was more important to keep schools open and keep roads repaired. And they eventually did a catch-up contribution, but they didn't make up the return on investment part of that contribution. So that was, that looks like a lesser sin now that we've got a multi-billion-dollar unfunded liability, because the impact was maybe only 100 to 150 million. Another big impact were those early retirements that some of you may remember, and even a few members still say, are we going to have another early retirement? The answer is no, never again. What they did is they just shifted the burden to the state pension system. If you let someone, I used to be a banker, and the first rule of credit is if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And if you tell someone, we'll give you 3 years of credit if you buy 3 years of credit and you can retire, that's great for the person, but you've just transferred the obligation to the pension system. And you've borrowed from the pension system, and back then we were expecting a rate of return of 8%. They later kicked it up to 8.25%, and more recently, earlier this year, down to an expected return of 7.5% per year. Doesn't matter what the number is, when you're borrowing from the pension system, that's the effective rate you're borrowing at. Most expensive rate going, as far as state government goes, much more expensive than bonds or anything else. I recently explained, if you came upon the pension system and tried to explain it to somebody, the numbers make people's eyes glaze over pretty quickly. So I was on Channel 10 a few weeks ago. I said, well, our pension system before the first round of reform 6 years ago was like buying a house with leaky pipes. The problem with a house with leaky pipes, you have a very high water bill. That's kind of the ongoing normal cost. And you have a basement that's flooded. That's the unfunded liability. Well, they fixed the leaky pipes. The 3 rounds of pension reform, barring our potential victory in a lawsuit, have brought the normal cost, and the normal cost in a pension system is defined as what it costs as a percentage of salary to cover the pension for a new starting employee. The normal cost for state employees is about 11.4% of salary, and for teachers it's about 11.8% of salary. That sounds like, a fair contribution for management to make on top of salary. That is significantly mitigated because most of that contribution is made by the employee themselves. A starting state employee pays 8.75% of their salary every paycheck to the pension. So that couple of percentage point differential is what management contributes to their actual pension. For a teacher, they pay 9.5% of their salary towards their pension. So that additional 2.3% management contribution goes towards their pension. Everything else goes to the unfunded liability, which doesn't really have anything to do with them. It has a little bit more to do with some of the employees who are closer to retirement and get slightly better benefits, through the changes that you saw from one of Lori's charts. But most of the problem is the unfunded liability. We fixed the leaky pipes, but the basement is still flooded. And we found out the basement was more flooded than we thought because 2 things happened earlier this year. One, the actuaries pointed out to us, and I still have a hard time believing this, but I have no reason to, or I don't know if my actuaries are going to say anything different from the state's actuaries. Apparently, Rhode Islanders have the distinction, Rhode Island retirees have the distinction of second only to Utah in longevity. Okay, I don't think we share a lot of characteristics with a primarily Mormon population based on my personal observation, but that's what the data shows. Part of it has to do with, a high percentage of women in our workforce and therefore women retirees who do live longer than men. Not only are they smarter, they live longer. They also, the actuaries tell us, retire a little earlier, which belies the intelligence I just referred to, because the retiring earlier is smarter, but retiring a few years earlier than men actually has to do with marriage patterns. The average, actuarially now, personal experience is notwithstanding, the average woman is married to someone who's a few years older than themselves, and the retirement comes at the same age. So that dictates retirement pay. You learn a lot from actuaries and mortality tables, all sorts of interest in trivia. But all those change with the new numbers. You can't go before you're age 62 now, and they're talking about making that age go further. The question I get asked most frequently, so for the 3rd time I have the distinction, along with my friend Phil Keefe, of being on what do we call it this time? The Pension Advisory Group for General Treasurer Raimondo. I was on the Governor Kachiri's Pension Study Commission and the Speaker Murphy's Pension Study Commission. So maybe the 3rd time's a charm, or maybe 3 strikes and you're out. We'll find out. But people say, well, what are we going to do? Well, my contention is we fix the leaky pipes. There's not a lot of room to go. If the normal cost is less than 12%, most of which is made up by a member contribution, now you can talk about different structures to get to the same result, but the normal cost is an important concept. And if you revolve around that normal cost, if you think it's fair, if employees are putting as much as 10% of their salary in, and you only need a couple percent more to cover the benefit, that seems immensely fair and cheaper than most 401ks. People talk about the federal hybrid system as an example. Well, the federal hybrid system costs the federal government about 18% of payroll. And people go, well, that can't be right. Well, that's what the actuaries tell us, and that's what in the 2nd study commission, the representative from the federal government came in and told us. So that's why they stopped talking about it in the last administration. Now they're talking about it again until this pension advisory group hears the same report, and they go, oh, well, that can't be good. The other problem is, what do you do about a big unfunded liability? Well, you have to pay it off, and with the new data, the immediate crisis is the expected management contribution from the state, from the taxpayers, is going to rise from $390 million to $620 million. That's a very big number to a much bigger number. So then you get a lot of other concepts on the table. Pension obligation bonds were mentioned. Pension obligation bonds are not as frightening as they used to be, because the bond rating agencies finally got smart. They said, you know, we should look at this pension liability as part of a state's indebtedness. They didn't used to do that, remarkably, or not as seriously as they do now. So if you transferred the debt from the pension fund to a bond, it suddenly showed up. Now it's showing up everywhere, because correctly we have to account for it in a very open and honest fashion. So that's one thing they can do. Another is, and I love the mention of, you know, being creative, that David did, creative with asset transfers, because I wrote an op-ed a few weeks ago. We own this casino-like entity up in northern Rhode Island that is arguably, our stake in it is we get 61% of the top line coming in. That's worth, by Wall Street standards, well over $3 billion. You know, if we discovered an oil well, we'd probably say, on state property, we'd say, oh, we have this wonderful asset. Well, we haven't. We have something gushing money up there, and there's a different way to look at it, so we're certainly encouraging that creativity. But I suspect, politics being what they are, they're going to also try and look at the current structure of benefits yet again. And we will point out what the normal cost is and how that works and what's sensible. The final thing you hear about is re-amortizing the debt. You know, my parable on that is, look, a kid gets into Harvard or Providence College, but doesn't get financial aid. You remortgage the house. It's an investment in the future. And there are great schools of thought on this. I'm kind of, the only thing in my life, I suppose, I'm fiscal conservative on. I'd rather have a fully funded pension plan just so we could stop doing these crazy study committees. But my friend Tom Segura's points out there are plenty of states that have open amortizations where they constantly do a 30-year amortization schedule and renew it every year, because there are more important short-term government purposes for money without burdening the taxpayers. I could live with that. I did the math last night, because this is what I do. I wake up, I say, you know, I wonder what the new reamortization is going to save us. Because we're going to have our first meeting on Monday, and I want to have an idea what I think the answer is. And my back-of-the-envelope calculation, if we took the 20 years remaining in our current 30-year amortization schedule and re-amortize, we'd probably knock that $620 million obligation down by about $125 million. That's real money. Yes, it does extend it to those out years, just like refinancing your houses. The alternative is not building roads and schools and financing important services of state government. So that's kind of where we are in Rhode Island. We've got a lawsuit hanging out over us. We've got another pension advisory group. We've got a threatened special session of the legislature to once again tackle the pension issue. The consequences of doing nothing are very expensive, and we have to figure out how to deal with this very big extra debt in the 2013 fiscal budget. We've got some talented and creative people from both sides or all sides of the table that are going to try and work on this issue and hope for the best. I don't want to try this a fourth time. They may not let me. They may figure out maybe I'm the problem. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you for joining us for this evening's edition of Labor Vision. We appreciate your input and encourage your comments. Labor Vision can be seen 3 times each week here on Channel 14. Join us on Tuesdays at 7 p.m., Thursdays at 8 p.m., and Saturdays at 5 p.m.